Good afternoon. A warm welcome to everyone to the afternoon's event. My name is Bob Smith. I'm an honorary research fellow in the School of Geography and Planning at Cardiff University. I'm also the knowledge exchange broker for Wales for something called the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, or CASH, as I should probably refer to it as we go through the afternoon. And our three speakers this afternoon, Flora Samuel, Paul Hickman and Pete Mackey, are all CASH co-investigators. Although School of Geography and Planning are hosting this event, it's really focusing around work that those people and colleagues have undertaken under the auspices of CASH. For those of you who are not familiar with what CASH is, basically it's a consortia of, I think it's 11 universities now, plus 2 non-academic partners, the Chartered Institute of Housing and the Royal Town Planning Institute. It's been funded since 2017 by 2 of the UK's research councils and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and staff are spread across different institutions. The aim of CASH has been to produce new research and evidence to help tackle the housing problems in the UK. And part of CASH's role is to try and embed knowledge and understanding, not just in academia, but in housing policy and practice. So part of CASH's role has been, as I say, to embed knowledge exchange across the UK. We do have a number of knowledge exchange staff working within CASH, and indeed I can see my colleague from Northern Ireland, Joe Frey, is on the call this afternoon. So welcome to Joe as well. We've also established under CASH a number of what we call knowledge exchange hubs, and these hubs have helped to shape the programme of research which CASH has undertaken over the last 3.5 years, as well as individual research projects. So the Wales Hub, and again, I know that there are members on the call who are part of the Wales Knowledge Exchange Hub. They've helped to identify housing research priorities from a Welsh perspective to inform the work of CASH, and also to comment upon a number of the individual projects being undertaken. This time last year, I think the Wales Hub met and considered the impacts and responses of housing policy in Wales to the COVID-19 pandemic. And following that, Pete Mackey and I put together a paper from a Welsh perspective, trying to shape the further work that CASH is doing, looking at housing and COVID-19. Purpose of the event this afternoon is to focus on a number of areas where CASH co-investigators have been looking at different aspects of housing policy in the UK. And I'm pleased to welcome 3 CASH co-investigators. Professor Flora Samuels from the University of Reading, and she'll be talking about research she's been engaged in across the UK on delivering design value. Professor Paul Hickman from Sheffield Hallam University will be talking about his work for CASH on tenant involvement. He's been doing work at the UK level, and I know that he's currently doing work with Joe in Northern Ireland as well. And last but not least, my colleague Pete Mackey from Cardiff University will talk about his work on homelessness. In organising the event, our thoughts, I suppose, have been turning to the elections which are coming up, and particularly the elections for the devolved administrations in Scotland and Wales. Next week, hopefully, CASH will be publishing papers both for Scotland and Wales, which will bring together quite a lot of work that CASH has done over the last 3.5 years to look at the evidence from this research to try and inform the developments of housing policy, and particularly to think about what policy developments might take place over the next 5 years under under the next Welsh Government. In that paper, we've identified 6 areas for research: affordable housing supply, homelessness, the private rented sector, tenant engagement, creating sustainable places, and finally the links between housing and health. And across each of those 6 areas, what we've tried to do is to provide a brief context of where housing policy is in Wales, and then to highlight some of the research which has been done by CASH in the recent past, which we think hopefully is informing and will inform the future development of housing policy. We're also highlighting research which is in the pipeline and which will be published later in 2021, which again hopefully will be of value to policymakers and practitioners in Wales over the future. We've also, based upon the research that we've looked at, tried to identify 12 key priorities for housing for the next Welsh Government, 2 each for the 6 areas that I've talked about. And in producing that paper, I think we're not only trying to provide a summary of key CASH research across these different areas in a single place, but I think also trying to emphasise for government, for policymakers, the importance of research and evidence in shaping housing policy, so that we're keen to see that Welsh Government has a rigorous appraisal approach, that it's monitoring the impacts of policy interventions, and that it is looking at serious evaluative approaches in key areas of housing policy. And all of that, I think, has implications for evidence and data. And again, I know there are Welsh Government civil servants on the call this afternoon who are involved in research and information within knowledge and analytics services. As I say, we've drawn in that paper on the work of the 3 speakers this afternoon, and probably about 30 odd other CASH publications. So as I say, we'll move on and start the presentations. Before we do, and before I introduce our first speaker, just a couple of housekeeping issues. All the microphones are set to mute. At the end of each presentation, we will take questions, and during the presentation, you can pose questions through the chat box. And then as we go into questions at the end of the 3 presentations, if you can raise your hand if you want to ask a specific question, then hopefully Pete or myself or others will spot you and we'll bring you in, and you can then unmute yourself. But if you can remain on mute when you're not speaking, so that it reduces the background noise. I'm sure everyone's now very familiar with Zoom and Teams and the need for muting. So as I say, if you have a question, so you can pose it in the chat box, or as I say, you can use the function to raise your hand at the end of the presentation. Hopefully we'll be able to take questions then. As I say, we're proposing now that we'll take questions after each of the 3 presentations, because I know that 2 of our speakers do have to leave before the end of the session. So we'll take questions after each of the 3 presentations, if that's okay. Okay, enough of me, and to move on then to the first of our 3 presentations this afternoon. It's a real pleasure to welcome and introduce Professor Flora Samuel, who is Professor of Architecture at the University of Reading and a CASH co-investigator. And I should say a former academic in the Welsh School of Architecture, where I believe, Flora, you worked for 10 years or more. CASH has been doing research on delivering design value, and Flora has been leading, I think, on this work, which I think started in the fairly early days of CASH about 3 years ago. I think one of the first pieces of research that CASH became involved in. And the main report from the study was published at the end of last year. And to some extent, I think it's an opportunity for Flora to present her findings in a Welsh context, and hopefully to be able to draw upon Welsh examples to flesh out her arguments. Flora is also currently working on a cash project looking at the impact of housing design and placemaking on social value and well-being during the pandemic. So she may want to also refer to that work as she goes along. But Flora, if we may, over to you, and thanks very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. So I may be at the University of Reading, but I'm a proud resident of Cardiff, and I've been here for 30 years or so, and seen a lot of change during that time. So it's very nice for me to have an opportunity to present this work really from a bit of a Welsh, give a bit of a Welsh angle on it. It's normally presented by James White from Glasgow University, who is the person who put all our studies together. So I did research based looking at housing estates in Bridgend. So I'm going to talk a little bit about project aims and objectives and our research methodology, and move into some to show which housing development case studies we looked at. And I'm going to focus quite a bit on the Welsh cases and talk, because quite a lot of because we were doing a study of 4 different nations, a lot of the detail, the rich and extraordinary detail I uncovered in Bridgend, I feel, doesn't always make its way into the report. So I'm going to focus a little bit on that. And then the recommendations of the report as a whole and some future steps and conclusions. Right, so to start, we are based on previous work that we did on what is design value. Which was a big systematic review of what is design value. We concluded that it was the triple bottom line of sustainability, social value, economic value, and environmental value, and that good quality design impacts positively on all of those things. And it was this idea that underpinned the work we were looking at here. So devolution has led to a very diverse design policy landscape in the UK, and I can't pretend to be an expert on Welsh policy, because I kind of got a dabbling in all 4 nations, which I think has something to be said for it as well. But despite all of this, the 4 governments do share the view that good design can deliver on economic, social, and environmental value, though they phrase it in very different kinds of ways. Now, despite everybody having lots of good intentions about design value, the quality of new build housing remains extremely poor, and the value of design is underappreciated. And we call this the housing design quality conundrum. How can it be, with all this good intention, that we end up with very poor quality housing? And Matthew Carmona and others have illustrated what I mean by that. So uniquely, we looked at all 4 nations, and we wanted to find out the extent to which design is valued during the various stages of planning, design, and developing new homes and neighbourhoods. So we wanted to develop an understanding of the cultural conditions and expertise needed to deliver design value and identify the critical points in the process when a commitment to design can result in higher quality outcomes. And one of the things I like about this project is it's based on the idea that everybody is responsible for design value. Sometimes it's always the architect who's supposed to be the person interested in design, but in my experience, everybody's interested in the design, and I have to say everybody has a responsibility in it too. So we looked at housing developments in one local authority in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. We tried to find housing estates that were average, and quite a lot of work went into that. So we did 48 semi-structured interviews with 54 participants, and we looked at documents and archives, and we used direct observation data as well. I should say that certainly in Bridgend, it was incredibly difficult to find anybody to talk about these estates. It was as though people had washed their hands of them and gone galloping off into the sunset. The churn within construction and planning companies meant people had just disappeared, and also volume house builders. I think it's for me, it was very striking that it was so hard to actually chase up the people who'd been involved in delivering these average places. So 5 members of the research team each collected the data, and we did a phased analysis, and then the lead author, who was James, put it all together. And these are estates that we looked at, the average estates in Didcot, in Tame, obviously a place where benefiting near Oxford, benefiting from very high house land values, and then less high land values in the banks in Rotherham and Sky House in Rotherham. And then we had Dovecote, Haddington, and Gateside West in Haddington as well. And then I was looking at those were in Glasgow, and then Park Derwent in Bridgend well, phase R19. Park Derwent is a very large development, and then phase 1 and 2 of Ysgol Bryn Castell in Bridgend. And the phase that's built is the one by Barrett's, and the one that's being built is the one by Persimmon. And then Chris Foy looked at these estates, Peter Pan and Portland 88 in Belfast. And it's very noticeable. In Northern Ireland, there are no volume house builders because it isn't financially viable for them to do work over there. Everything's done by local builders, which is an interesting thing. So these are, we tried to make a diagram which we hope would be useful to people about critical points of intervention, where things that can make a real difference to design value along the journey. And actually for me, and in the discussion of Wales, I think the most critical point was the selling of land and the valuation of land. And I'll come back to that. So this is the Wales case study in Bridgend. Park Derwent is quite near that big out-of-town shopping centre that you pass on the M4. And Ysgol Bryn Castell is right in the centre, really within 1 mile of the city centre. So it's quite nicely situated. So Park Derwent, it's a big master planned extension divided into lots. And it had a design code. It was set up with very nice intentions. So a design code with very good guidance on how placemaking and quality of homes. But by the time it got to R19, over-optimistic predictions on sales were used as an excuse to not use the best quality or the quality of house builder models that have been required. A different road format was brought into play, and also the affordable housing was not delivered. So this is what I mean about the value of land. So at Park Derwent, there are 3 organic perimeter blocks with numerous connections to other phases, not a very remarkable house type. And really, as you can see from these pictures, the landscaping is not the greatest, little variation to hardscape, and really excessive parking provision. Everybody was frustrated. The planners, the house builders, everyone I spoke to was frustrated by the parking provision, which included having a parking space for every single bedroom. Even a bed that was not big enough to hold a bed, but actually just held a cot, had to have a parking space. So I couldn't get to the bottom of why, really, why that actually played out on the estate. And then Ysgol Bryn Castell is a brownfield site in 2 phases on 2 schools, old schools in Bridgend. There was no development brief. It was land that belonged to Bridgend Council, and the only requirement was to comply with basic Welsh standards. So it's a long, narrow site with simple cul-de-sac arrangement. And the thing that I found quite distressing was a very poor connection between phases. Here you see the end of the cul-de-sac, but the Persimmon, the next development, the integration between the 2 phases may be 1 footpath, but that's it. So the parcelling up of land really made poor integration across the site. So there are semi-detached and detached standard house types, and one-story block, and a very limited landscaping palette as well. So the planners and everybody I talked to were very, very enthusiastic about Planning Policy Wales, and rightly so, I believe. It's a policy that we are to be proud of. But really, it hadn't yet impacted on any of the case studies. Everybody felt that the need for strong policy was clear, and the planning officers felt they very much needed to feel confident that if they refused a project, that it would be backed up by the planning expectorate. Generally, they were overwhelmed with policies and guidance, a huge caseload, very, very difficult for them to go against the grain of letting projects through. So they were very keen that they had, and were waiting to hear, in way, testing projects to see what happened, and whether they went through on appeal. And across the board, everyone believed that there much greater connection was needed between health and planning, and they were Right. So a few things about the different stages we discovered. So the planning officers and the team at Bridgend felt that the design codes were very helpful for maintaining standard, but it took a considerable amount of resource to do that properly and indeed to enforce those things. The councillors I spoke to felt that the planning officers were very fearful of losing the goodwill of the housing developers because of the pressure that they're under to deliver numbers. Pressure to deliver numbers was oppressive. Numbers and not quality seemed to be the name of the game. And this is rather an extreme quote by one development planning manager: Persimmon developments offer us nothing other than future ghettos. So the valuation of land, as I said, seemed to have been excessive, meaning that Persimmon used value managed down the design quality of Park Derwent R19 phased houses. And they didn't deliver affordable housing either at Ysgol Bryn Castell. That was a commuted sum was paid in compensation, and I'm yet to find out how it works for commuted sums to build affordable houses elsewhere. I should say that Ysgol Bryn Castell had has very good transport links and infrastructure, but Park Derwent as yet has no transport links into Bridgend whatsoever. They're doing really, really good work on active travel routes, but it's a chicken and egg thing. You can't, a private bus service won't run without enough people, and enough people won't get on that service when there isn't one. So very serious concerns about transportation here. Local authority planner here saying, I think whatever they pay for the land really drives design quality. Yeah, I think that's something that maybe needs to be flipped on its head a bit, and people start pushing back on landowners and saying that actually they need to invest more in the actual design, the facilities on the sites. And from what the investigation I've been doing around, it seems that land valuation is generally done very optimistic assessments of what can be built and what returns are going to be. Right. In terms of the design, the planning application, the planners were very frustrated by lack of discussion, lack of early discussion with developers. And they felt, and it wasn't just them that felt, that projects, by the time they got to see them, and also by the time the community got to see them, the projects were just too fixed, and there was very little scope to make meaningful changes. Councillors, I would say, generally felt very disenfranchised from the process, but some were arguing for a standard for the provision of play space, and brought out the sample of the Fields in Trust Fit Standard, which is used by some authorities in Wales, but is not compulsory, but seemed to be an excellent initiative. So one consultant told me that they made stronger arguments based on the precepts of the Future Generations Act, but they fall on deaf ears at local authority level. That's certainly been my experience in Cardiff as well. Maybe it's just because we haven't yet got to the point of the excellent planning provision that's been happening recently hasn't really got to the point of being implemented. So major changes happened through value engineering, which were not considered material changes as far as the planners were concerned, and therefore didn't require a resubmission of planning. And these were huge changes of quality in the actual quality of the building. The big challenge around the adoption of green space and trees. I mean, we know in Wales there's been reports on terrible difficulty about adoption of land and trees. Nobody wants to do it. Nobody has the money. And the very stretched highways department had extremely little bandwidth for placemaking, operating on in the most skeletal way on a safety first approach. So a quote from a planning consultant here: definitely a stage where you'll see a dilution of design, whether it be through materials or surface treatments and landscaping. It will all be pared back. And so that either before planning submission or even after you've got a determination. So what went through planning is pared back through value engineering commonly. So in conclusion, planning policy about the Welsh section, planning policy Wales is just beginning to be used and tested in Bridgend. Planners were anxious to see whether their rulings would be upheld when taken to appeal. A new legislation on sustainability seems set to make make the common volume house builder model unviable in Wales. The second phase of Ysgol Bryn Castell was they zoomed it in, trying to get it in there before the sustainable urban drainage legislation came in. And the house builder models are so tight that all this new legislation is going to make it hard for them. And then we also very much found that lack of resourcing within planning highways and parks has impacted strongly on design value. And a sad quote here, in a development like this, climate change doesn't really feature at all. So back to the project overall. We found that national and local design policy and guidance was frequently overlooked because other policy objectives took place, generally housing numbers. There was a chronic lack of resourcing and scarcity of design skills in local authorities, meaning that design governance was severely restricted, and also deep inconsistencies across local authorities. Engagement with local communities was very top-down and very stop-start and very poorly implemented. But having said that, design value is a shared responsibility. We cooked up this leaky bucket of where all the value was dripping out of the housing systems. House builders have razor-sharp focus on profitability, and they'll do what they're told to do in a sense, or what they can get away with, and they exhibit a limited interest in design. And they're rarely prepared to make design investments in areas where land values are low. So there's a culture of low expectation. Master plans can help, but they're often poorly enforced. And due to resourcing challenges, there's often a lack of scrutiny over decisions taken on site after planning permission. And further, post-occupancy evaluation, going back and seeing whether the project worked, learning from mistakes, very rarely happens indeed. So we came up with a few principles. Really, the housing and neighbourhood, design principles should be regulated by the 4 UK governments in design value standards, which would be, if they could involve environment, social and economic, wonderful. Local authority, and it's interesting that England is moving to this thing of design codes, and I think this will move to more codified ways of doing things. But local authorities must still be able to judge matters of context and fit. A particularly nice example of placemaking standard is the Scottish Place Standard tool, if you're not familiar with it. And so we came up with a series of further recommendations, which you can go read for yourself. But really, the 4 UK governments should be encouraging and supporting a far more diverse house building industry. And housing land allocation should be based on sustainable development principles and prioritise brownfield development. I think that's true until, I mean, there are actually increasingly large amount of cases where there's much more biodiversity and environmental good things happening on brownfield sites rather than blasted agricultural land which has been blasted by pesticides and fertilizers over many years. I think the whether to build on brownfield and greenfield is going to become increasingly up for grabs as we understand more about spatially localized value. But mainly, the house building industry must stop receiving a free pass on design. It is an essential public good, and future planning reforms must put design at their heart. So design value standards should become a precept for addressing the climate urgency and help us to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think there's many opportunities here to be building back better. So these were the project supporters. We had support from every government, which was just great. And the report can be found on the CASH website. So I'm going to stop sharing and say thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much indeed, Flora. It was a really interesting presentation. Certainly my first opportunity to hear about your research. I'm sure that's true for many people here in Wales. So thanks very much for that. I noticed as we've gone along, there have been one or two comments in the chat box, which have been sort of technical responses to some of the issues you've raised. But can I ask if there are individuals who want to ask questions of Flora, could they raise their hand?
Oh, Tanja Sterling raised.
Hi, Flora, thank you very much for that. It's really interesting. It's just an observation and reflection, really. I live in Cardiff, and there's a big issue at the moment around Cardiff planning decisions around Section 106 and affordable housing, and the same issue, developers overpaying for land, probably, and then what gets squeezed out, as you say, is the design, is anything nice, really, or anything that the developers might deem extra, and the affordable housing. Particular extreme example, just gone through 430 something flats in the city centre, no affordable housing, none at all. The council asked for 6.5 million, got nothing. So it's just, it makes a mockery of the policy.
Exactly.
So, but a big issue to me seems to be about the capacity you raised as part of your research, and I think it's a really difficult one to address given where local authority budgets are likely to go, given all the COVID pressures, etc., in the coming years. Is that capacity within local government to have the different skills within the teams to really address design, be on top of sustainable development? Some of it's quite fast moving agendas, but also that kind of heft and oomph to actually not take, to actually stand up. Some authorities do manage to stand up to developers, don't they? And they just have this is the way we do business around here. And not all the developers go kind of running for the hills. So but I think it's, we've got by and large small authorities in Wales, and I do have you can have great policy, great intent, but actually how do we, in the context of what might be very limited local authority budgets, how do we actually address that capacity and sort of negotiating heft issue within local government?
Yeah, no, I completely hear what you say, and I think I gather there are a lot of local authorities in Wales, and people are looking into combining local authorities into sort of larger units so that they can start sharing more of their resources. And I suppose that has to be a way forward. There are hardly any urban designers in Wales, and the ones that there are shared across many authorities. I think a lot more is going to have to be automated. And I think Scotland has got an amazing digital planning strategy around strategic planning maps, and then moving into hyperlocal maps. And my own personal research work is around this map making, where we use passive data, existing data on things like indices of deprivation and so on. And then we overlay it with social value maps made with local people about what they want. And that's just one example, but I think the Greater Manchester Council has done an incredible map-making effort. So I think that digital tools are increasingly going to be useful for doing things better. And it's questionable whether your average planner who's very much under stress, whether the right place for them is actually making decisions about extensions and whatnot. Maybe it's got to be rationalized and codified, but that is going to take investment to do that, to make it much more evidence-based and to make space there for the proper consultation that's so desperately needed. In the street where I am in Cardiff, just this week we had a planning battle, and it makes your eyes water to see how little consideration there's given of the community. So I have no easy answers on that, but I do believe that technology will come in a lot, and we just having to rationalize. But also, well, I'm writing a book on a post-neoliberal housing system. Wait, the answer's in there. My fantasy, as somebody said to me, pigs might fly, but there we are.
Thanks very much for your question, Tamsin. Thanks, Flora. In the chat box, I see there's a question from Kay Powell about you've identified sort of inflated land values and the profit motive of developers, and whether you've got any further comments you want to make on that.
Well, it's a very good question. And I think that we all have to get up close and personal with valuation experts. As a background piece of work for this Delivering Design Value report, I did a huge thing called the Contextual Review that was never actually published, and interviewed a lot of people to find out what was happening at every stage of the journey, so that we made sure that we had pretty much everything covered. And there's a lot of nuance going into the way that valuation happens. And but there's a very growing area of green valuation, which is coming through, which is exciting. And there's a lot of discussion happening. Organizations like the Green Economy are talking to funders and banks about green bonds and other ways of financing things. So I'm hopeful, actually, that valuation is going to change to accommodate social and economic, so that the true cost of things is actually built into land valuation. But I mean, it is a real problem. Even just one of the, the buzz of a development happening. So I know this isn't an example. This is Oxford and Cambridge corridor. Everybody keeps talking about how that's going to be developed up, and of course the developers are onto it like bees on a honeypot, and they're going to be making the financial benefit from the uplift. Why don't we have a system where the public sector benefits from that uplift of public sector investment? Yeah. So I didn't really answer it, but it's an internal beef. Mari Vicker has raised a hand.
I can see, yes. Mo, do you want to come in with your question?
Yes, thanks.
Mari?
Thanks, Flora, for a really clear presentation. I think it has really mixed the issues so transparent. I saw a presentation a number of years ago from the chief architect in Copenhagen, who worked closely with the mayor and had regulatory powers over developers and was able to turn developers down. And it would seem that the well-being of future generations could offer that kind of role. But I wondered if there are any recommendations you make in terms of a position that might have some regulatory power.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, we didn't encounter it in the research here, but everything goes to show that when you have, well, actually, we did encounter it. Lots of people I interviewed wanted a place champion. They wanted a strong place champion at the top of local authorities who was looking holistically at the whole thing and who had powers to rein in some of the stuff that was happening at the local level, and made the planners feel protected that their decisions, their place-based decisions, would be carried through. So there was very strong desire for place champions within the people we interviewed and other people that we interviewed for the contextual review. And everything goes to show that when you have a person in charge of placemaking, or you have a mayor with a strong placemaking interests like George Ferguson at Bristol, he happened to be an architect, didn't he, that emphasis goes back onto design value, and there's a sort of shift towards looking at things holistically as opposed to infighting across lots of little pots of cash. And it's been very interesting in the pandemic that emergency teams have had to come together and talk together who never talked together before, and have thrown up all sorts of interesting opportunities for collaborative working between planning and say health and universities or whatever. So I think we really need to think of different ways of organizing design governance, actually, both at the macro scale and at the micro scale. Thank you. Great question, Mark.
Thanks, Flora, and thanks for the questions.